Hello and welcome everyone to the second flash panel by the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent war and humanitarian crisis. The School of History, Philosophy, and Religion created these flash panels as a way to provide students with information and analysis about current events and important national developments. Our goal is to provide essential, expert, nonpartisan analysis of some of the most pressing issues in the world today to our students and to our community. This is an important function of a university education and our responsibility as educators and scholars to help our students develop more nuanced and complex ways of understanding and responding to the world they inhabit, even and maybe especially about painful topics like war. These are tense times, and I would remind everyone that this is an educational forum. As faculty in the liberal arts, we absolutely believe that people of goodwill can discuss sensitive issues calmly and rationally. And indeed, for the health of our democracy, it is essential that we discuss difficult topics, that we apply the insights of experts to complex issues, and that we keep respect for each other in the forefront of our interactions. At the same time, the sheer magnitude and depth of human suffering happening in Ukraine right now is difficult to grasp and even harder to accept. And to that end, there's a list of reputable humanitarian organizations that's posted in the chat to which you can donate if you feel compelled. As ever, we are grateful to those who have made this panel possible. Thank you to the College of Liberal Arts Dean, Larry Rogers, to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion Director, Nicole von Germeten and Suzanne Giftai, to Erin Sneller and Natalia Bueno for their support and their assistance. As we discuss the invasion and displacement of sovereign people, it is important to acknowledge that Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River Ampinephew Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. And now to the panel itself. Each panelist will offer 8 minutes or so of commentary, and then we will have time for people to pose questions to the panelists. As I'm sure many of you have questions, we want the Q&A to be as efficient as possible so the panel can respond to as many questions as possible. If you have a question you would like to ask, please share it in the Q&A forum. And finally, our moderator today is Dr. Catherine Hubler. Dr. Hubler is a senior instructor in history with expertise in the history of human rights and modern genocides.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you to our panelists and for everyone who's in attendance today. Today's topic is a timely one, to be sure, as over 4 million Ukrainians, mostly women and children, have fled warfare in Ukraine. And according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, over 6.5 million people are internally displaced within Ukraine currently. So let's move on to the panelists today to talk about this conflict and its real human cost. So speaking first, we have Dr. Linda Richards. Dr. Richards is a senior instructor in history with a specialization in Cold War nuclear history, environmental justice, and the history of peace and peacemaking. After Dr. Richards, we will hear from Dr. Paul Wanke, who is a senior instructor in history with a specialization in the histories of Russia and military engagement. Following Dr. Wanke will be Dr. Sarah Henderson, who is an associate professor in political science with a specialization in the politics of Russian civil society. Following Dr. Henderson, we will hear from Mark Ward, who is a retired Foreign Service officer and humanitarian leader with experience working with persons displaced by warfare and natural disasters, most recently in Afghanistan. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Sharyn Clough, who is a professor of philosophy with a specialization in epistemic and political issues in the construction of scientific knowledge. Dr. Clough is also the curriculum coordinator for the Peace Literacy Institute. So thank you so much to the esteemed panelists who will be speaking. And at this point, I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Linda Richards.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thanks to everyone for organizing this very important event. My internet connection is actually unstable, so I'm actually going to stop my video and just try to show my slides that I've prepared. I'm pretty overwhelmed with all the aspects of this crisis. I work on nuclear history, and I'm sure everyone is overwhelmed. But here's a shot of Mariupol today. Mariupol was a bastion of 2014 total civil resistance. And I had some thoughts about why that particular spot was targeted in the way it was, knowing that many of the nonviolent strategists and analysts had used Mariupol as an example of a successful civil resistance against totalitarianism in the past. But so I have burning questions that connect with this crisis. I have long-term views as well, but I do have some things that are pressing I want to share with you. But to frame where I'm coming from, my ongoing questions have been, why is military power so helpless to protect the innocent, to protect civilians, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, and many of these conflicts that we never hear about, from the Congo to Afghanistan to our internal country, where the most vulnerable are the ones who are not protected. And why is this continuing? So I feel we are clearly seeing that power over models alone fail to create the world that we want. And my interpretation of world events reads the message that we must sincerely find the right tools for conflict. I had a student just yesterday morning comment that maybe part of the problem is that there is not an either or. We need not all military nor all nonviolent solutions, but we need a range of tools. And my personal thinking is that we need to develop sincere understandings of what is self-defense and where does offense begin, to really resolve the conflicts and establish social systems that have power with models as opposed to power over models, which is the most common model most of us are used to. And when there's a conflict, most people turning to those kinds of models, not knowing where, I don't want to go on about my personal opinion. I actually meant to get right to some of the conflicts around nuclear issues that we're dealing with in Ukraine. I wanted to share briefly that I feel all this connects to a nuclear-free weapons future. The symbol for Ukraine being the sunflower is also the symbol for a nuclear-free future. And there's reasons for that I would go into in a longer time, if I had longer time, but I really want to address and let people know there's resources out there to track the nuclear aspects of this conflict. One of them is Beyond Nuclear. They have been releasing information in the last 24 hours about the severity of illnesses, of perhaps even deaths among soldiers who've been exposed on the Chernobyl site. And there's also news from the IAEA, currently Grossi, I'm probably pronouncing that poorly, but but the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency is currently in Ukraine. We've been advocating for help from the IAEA for some time, but they are actually not the most, they're thought of as a watchdog for nuclear issues, but they're invested in being proponents of nuclear. So we aren't actually able to completely, it would be foolish to trust them, but we have no better organized group that we can turn to at times like this. So this is another gap in civil society. We need independent scientific organizations that we can trust when there's nuclear concerns. Here we have just recent news. I'm just showing the sarcophagus in Chernobyl for people who aren't familiar. There's many things you can read to learn about the history of Chernobyl, which I won't go into right now, but the important thing is to know that the land being disturbed. I learned from an IAEA expert recently that the nuclear waste buried there in some places in very shallow trenches, and that as you know, soldiers have been exposed probably to dangerous amounts of radiation while on the site. There's also immediate concerns right now about munitions possibly exploding. And so I wanted to make sure I had this list of things to make sure I spoke to you about all of them, but they're all very frightening. There were wildfires just last week on the Chernobyl site, which can release radiation. February 24th, right away during the Russian invasion, there was a radiation spike at Chernobyl that was detected by observers who follow Chernobyl and are experts involved with the Chernobyl cleanup. And then after that spike, the radiation monitors were taken offline. Very frightening. The IAEA, I mentioned already the shallow trenching, but there's been reports of 7 buses of ill workers with acute radiation syndrome, perhaps even deaths. I'm hoping all of this is exaggerated and of course, fake news, but it points out the lack of our ability to rely on information and even get information about radiation releases. Currently, and for the last few weeks, there's been no supervision in accordance with IAEA safeguards for nuclear materials. One of my real concerns about one of the evacuation plans for Mariupol is that the corridors would be walking them right into Zaporizhzhia, which I don't quite understand. We have had a removal of nuclear fuel from Zaporizhzhia. Possibly, the experts believe to study the Westinghouse mix of fuel, just hopefully so that Russia can copy that fuel because they've had success, because it's a much easier to use fuel. And they, hopefully it's just something like that they want to copy. Workers, as many of you are probably very aware, workers have been held against their will without proper rest or food. And the operation of these plants is very intense. They have very complicated purification systems and engineering systems. 4 plants in total with 18 reactors. Not all are actually online, but many of these sites contain spent nuclear fuel, which has to be monitored and in certain safe conditions. And even under the best conditions, operating nuclear power plants can be extremely difficult. They're very vulnerable to human error, environmental conditions, and warfare. And so if there's releases, I actually had trusted that the CTBTO office would inform us if there was any large scale releases. And you can imagine my despair just recently going to their page and seeing them celebrating their anniversary, which I really certainly didn't expect. And then I went into the expert page, which is where I can usually go and check on any kind of releases in the expert area. And it was offline today. I don't know how long it's been. I should have been checking this more often. I just kind of took it for granted that the CTBTO would be there to give us somewhat fair information. It's important to know that most of the agencies that are monitoring are also invested in not, revealing some of the extent of the harms that may be happening. But this is a webinar I went to recently. I put this slide up so I would make sure to do a shout out for Andrei Ojarovov, who risked probably his life to give information about that radiation spike. And I'm hoping that he is safe. He is a Russian scientist at great risk to himself, speaking out. The IAEA is thought of as a watchdog by most people, but there's plenty of literature people can research and learn about some of the history of these nuclear organizations, and just being aware that there is information at the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. I originally had hoped to talk about the rise of nonviolent movements and their success in my few minutes that I have, but I want to make sure you all see just a little bit of Civil Resistance, a new book out And the slide backwards, which I skipped over by accident, I guess I shouldn't have tried that. Talking about how we need to develop new systems to deal with conflicts, and that there actually is a lot of knowledge if we can find new tools to resolve conflicts. So encouraging all of you to do that. And also doing our part. And there is a rally. I want people to know there's a local rally. Let's use our taxes for a better world, being organized by Veterans for Peace. For those of you that want to try and make a contribution for a better world, in seeking ways to invest in nonviolent alternatives to war, Howland Plaza, Saturday, April 16th. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Linda. Especially thank you for highlighting some of these threats that are presented by the military actions that are taking place around Chernobyl. This is really sobering information, but I think it also really widens our definition of the costs and risks of this war. I mean, we'll clearly be talking about a humanitarian crisis, but this itself, right, is as fundamental. You're dealing with issues of habitability and environmental livability. So thank you for that, and thank you also for concluding with a hopeful message about collective action too. So at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Paul Wanke.
Hey, thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Linda. So what I thought maybe I could do with this this short period of time is try to develop some sort of a template in which we can all look at the information that's coming in. I still remember that Vietnam was first called the first televised war. It almost seems like this is the first social media war, and we're just overwhelmed with information. So with that in mind, I'd like to look at or throw out the idea of the concept of grand strategy, especially from the Russian point of view. Vladimir Putin has said on more than one occasion that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And a way to look at this might be a historical tradition of the idea of Russian greatness, born in a very harsh environment, but also there's a religious aspect there where there was the original Rome. Later it moves to, when Western Rome collapses, it moves to Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, the second Rome. And for some Russians, especially in the Russian Orthodox Church, the third and final Rome is Moscow. Russia deserves, in their mind, greatness and respect. And for Vladimir Putin, that was lost to some degree with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So perhaps a thing to look at here is, how does Ukraine play into all of this? Well, you pick up a textbook of Russian history, and pretty much the first couple of chapters are going to talk about Kievan Rus. The first chapter usually is about all the variety of Slavic tribes there, but eventually along the Dnieper River, the city of Kiev will be developed, and it's going to be a bridge between the Scandinavian Baltic seas down to the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. That Kievan Rus Empire arguably eventually goes under with the rise of the Mongols, and the power shift in what we'll call now Russia, let's say, moves north into the forest areas where, while the Mongols will still have some control, they're not as comfortable as the steppe lands of Kiev and Ukraine. They're a tradition, arguably, or a concept of how they see themselves, is the idea of expansion. Russia will eventually expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But in the West, there's this idea under either it's Peter or Catherine the Great. A consistent theme you see is the search for warm weather ports. Peter moves up to the Baltic Sea. Eventually, will create the city of St. Petersburg out of the swamps. But the Black Sea is the real, that's a warm weather port. Let's put it that way. And in order to get to that, you have to get back to Ukraine. Well, Ukraine again went under the Mongols, but as power shifted to the north to Russia, the influence of Poland, the Lithuanian empires will move into Ukraine, and with them, they'll bring the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. So Ukraine will start to, I mean, there's certainly a lot of Slavic similarities between the two, but you start to see differences start to form. To move along, if that is in fact true, that the grand strategy of Russia is to become respected, to see themselves as they, depending on who you talk to, they don't see themselves as Western or Eastern. They see themselves as Russian, a society that may in fact be better than either one of the other two. Now, with this being an emphasis on, let's say, the military, there's strategies in order to achieve this grand strategic goal. And the strategies can be all sorts of things. For example, it can be purely, hopefully you can see this, it can be purely symbolic. One of the first things that the newly elected President Putin will do domestically is he'll travel south to the city of Volgograd, which during the Great Patriotic War, which is what the Russians still call the Second World War, this is the monument to the victory at Stalingrad, where eventually the German Sixth Army will be defeated and surrender, and the Soviets will now start pushing back the Germans, arguably one of the highlights of Soviet/Russian history during the Great War. Another part, again, as I mentioned, is religion. Putin will also, which may be strange for someone who was a Bolshevik member and so on like that, this is the modern mausoleum of the bodies of Nicholas II and his family, who were assassinated during the Bolshevik Revolution and so on. They were enemies of the state under the Soviet Union, but now for Russia, for Mother Russia, they will be interred, be brought back to St. Petersburg, buried with great ceremony, and eventually Nicholas II will be canonized as a saint. Now, the other part, however, is that to emphasize here is the military part. That's this card that's being played now. And arguably speaking, the card is being played in a part to, again, restore this mythical idea of Russian greatness. Okay. And I would suggest, by the way, that almost all societies have their own myths and so on. But Ukraine can be important to restore this sense of what Russia used to be, that whole idea of warm weather ports, the Black Sea, and so on. Now, regarding the actual fighting that we've seen now, I would suggest that right now, pretty much all pundits regarding the military aspects are operating on speculation. But there is during this, the break between the First and Second World Wars, one of the military questions was, how do you restore mobility to the battlefield? The Germans infamously came up with blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare, but the Soviets also came up with an idea. And I think that might be something to bear in mind as we watch this play out. They come up with a thing called operational warfare, a transition between tactics and strategy, okay? And try to imagine playing pool in a pub somewhere, and there's a person there who's a very good shot, and they can shoot the ball in from any place on the table. However, when the cue ball comes to a stop, the person is not in position to make a second shot. What was somewhat unique in this idea of operational strategy was linking tactics to strategy, meaning the shooter hits the 7 ball in the corner, but when the cue ball stops, it's also in line with the next shot and the next shot and the next shot. With that in mind, to finish up, this map of Ukraine here, so you can see that, hopefully you can see the Donetsk and Luhansk areas to the, that would be to the east there against the Russian Federation. That peninsula you see down to the south sticking into the Black Sea, that is the Crimean Peninsula. Strategically, it appears that Mariupol, unfortunately, is right in the middle of where the Russian Federation would love to have a land link connecting Crimea through Donetsk and Luhansk and so on, and linking it together. Right now, there's talk of there's a pause in the fighting, and it appears to be forces are relocating and so on. This would not be unusual if what's going on is an operational plan, meaning once they made the connection along the Azov Sea to the Crimean Peninsula, that first objective has been done. Now they're setting up the table, if you will, for their next phase. Another phase could very well be, if you see there the Dnieper River running up from Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, then turning north and west, eventually to Kiev, that is a natural point that in Soviet Russian strategy would be classic textbook to solution to this problem. And that is move up to the Dnieper River, control all of that, and essentially make everything east of the river part of the Russian Federation or some sort of satellite states, and leave Western Ukraine as, its semi-independence. But notice that would, in a sense, solve the solution of what was perceived as a direct Russian threat on Russian territory, Russian Federation, and so on. It would also be a step in restoring the idea of a great Russia and its grand strategy. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I hope maybe, again, that'll give you some sort of template to look at things.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wanke. And thank you for this key historical context and troubling insights into a potential split of, or a potential Russian desired split of Ukraine into an independent Ukraine and something more like a satellite state or a part of Ukraine that has a strong Russian sphere of influence. So now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Sarah Henderson, who will be speaking about the refugee crisis and international policy.
All right, thank you, Catherine. So first I thought I would start really quickly as one of the people, along with Dr. Wanke, that teaches Russia, either Russian history or Russian politics. Just a quick update. Catherine gave us an update on the refugee status. I would only add to that sort of where the Ukrainian refugees are going. It looks like by far the vast number are going to Poland, followed by Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Russia. And part of what has facilitated this quick process, because I want to flip around to that towards the end, thinking about what's different between this refugee crisis and the last one that Russia experienced with Syria is part of it is that Ukrainians, as participants in the free trade agreement with the EU, are legally able to enter the EU with a 3-month visa, which has been extended to 3 years. And so this has been one key difference, that there's not that kind of fundamental battle to establish refugee or asylum status. So it looks like the refugee flow has begun to slow down somewhat, and I think that comes with kind of the second update, which has been critical changes in Russia's strategy, which Dr. Wanke was telling us a little bit about. That it's hard to know what's true and not true, but there seems to be pretty conclusive evidence that that the Russian army is underprepared. There seems to be a high casualty rate, not only for soldiers, but potentially for high-ranking generals. The Russian minister himself of defense, Sergei Shoigu, seemed to disappear from public view for several weeks. There are stories indicating that Putin is not being accurately briefed on the war. And for the Ukrainian army, simply not losing immediately, which was the expectation, has been a tremendous victory. And I think this is significant in 3 ways. One, it seems that Russia is reshifting its focus on Eastern Ukraine, as Dr. Wanke was indicating, back to kind of the Donbass region. But I think that's more significant than just a territory shift, and that could end up having, kind of even worse ramifications for Ukrainian population living in that area. But I think we've also seen a rhetorical shift on Russia's side away from initial plans on denazifying Ukraine, which essentially was kind of code for regime change, taking out Zelensky, and back to what it said its original purpose was, which was liberating what it saw or what it was trying to frame as the two territories of Luhansk and Donetsk. And to kind of focus on demilitarizing Eastern Ukraine, and that's what part of attacking Mariupol is from the Russian perspective, and complete that land bridge that Dr. Wanke was talking about. And so there's a lot of speculation that this is a kind of face-saving retreat so that President Putin can claim victory, but hopefully negotiate on a crisis. I think a third ramification of this shift is that there's a little bit more similarity now between what Ukraine under Zelensky is saying Ukraine might be willing to negotiate over and give up, and kind of versus what Russia wants. Before, there was almost no overlap. Now there is a little bit more overlap, where Zelensky has raised the issue of Ukrainian neutrality if Ukrainians vote for it in a referendum. I was just listening to an interview that Zelensky did with The Economist yesterday, in which he mentioned a willingness to potentially cede territory, saying, territory is just territory, people are kind of irreplaceable. And so that's a little bit different than sort of what the Western media is portraying, which makes me a little bit nervous, in that the Western media is saying, hey, can Ukraine win this war? President Zelensky seems to be signaling a slightly different position, which understandably, as president of the nation actually under siege, may not be as willing to push the Ukrainian war to its limits. But that's kind of the update that Russia is maybe stepping back, that the war, or the terrain of the war, is going to shift. But I think, as Dr. Wanke was alluding to, the hopes for a potential end to this, I don't see that anytime soon. Now, when I re-looked at the title for today's panel, I sat at my desk for a bit, and as the social scientist literally started making a list of the various costs of the human costs of the Ukrainian war, to start thinking about the staggering kind of domino effect of human costs, not just in Ukraine, but the neighboring countries, Russia, and then, since I am now this term teaching international development policy in the developing world. And rather than kind of going through that list and thinking about how the war is impacting more than soldiers' lives, that economic growth comes to a screeching halt, school enrollments drop, medical care is compromised, I want to maybe toss out some bigger picture things to think about. So for Ukraine, it's grotesque to perhaps think about this as a gain. So I'm not sure what the appropriate wording is, but I think one of the social ramifications of this war is that if Ukrainian elections until this war tended to be fought along the fault lines of pro-West versus pro-Western policy, that is over. So this has solidified Ukrainian identity as something very separate from Russia historically, culturally, and politically. And I think that is quite significant in the sense that for anyone who followed Ukrainian politics before Zelensky, it was very reminiscent of kind of Russian politics in the 1990s. Which is Ukrainian presidents could not get up the social support really to serve more than one term, that there was an interpenetration of economic elite and political elite, that Ukrainian politics was prey to excessive corruption. And so one thing that hopefully will happen, as does after utter destruction, is the ability for Ukraine to make a break with its political past. I also hope that the price Europe is willing to pay for providing weapons, but drawing the line at a no-fly zone, et cetera, would be a path to EU membership. It's probably hard, and I just have two more points at this point, to think of social costs for Russia and Russians at the midst of this war. But I do just want to reiterate that this is really Putin's war, not Russia's war. And the social cost for everyday average Russians has been and will be huge for this policy attempt that Putin is making, this war that he is waging. First, if we're to believe the press, Russian military losses have been substantial, and I think that loss is particularly tragic because many of those soldiers are simply conscripts. That is, every Russian male has to serve a year in the military. They're not supposed to be used in combat, but they are. April right now is a sign-up month for Russia, where existing conscripts either decide whether they're going to sign up again, but also families are sending their sons for a year into a Russian military that seems to be sending its sons to be killed. So I think this is a critical month to watch domestically what's happening. I think we also know that the sanctions are going to be crippling for Russians, and I think it's an economic, more than an economic cost. The social cost is for the average day Russian, this is the death of the idea, at least for the near future, that Russia is a European country. And by European country, I mean a country which aspires to be led by the rule of law, in which leaders are checked at the power, in which people can aspire to a relatively pleasant standard of living. I think the final point I want to make that I also think we want to make sure that doesn't get lost in this is that the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine are extending beyond Europe and into the developing world in a number of ways. One, I think the optics of how Europe has responded to the refugee crisis as opposed to Syria. I think Europe and the United States needs to come up with a response to that. I think we have to be mindful that there, despite the large number of countries that voted against Russia in the UN, there were a lot of countries that abstained. And so particularly countries like India and China. And so I think it's important for Europe and the United States to show how it can be compassionate to refugees beyond Ukrainians if it wants to think about kind of the long-term kind of ramifications of how power is shifting. The last thing I want to talk about is this two big wheat producers, Russia and Ukraine, are both going to have dramatically different harvests. Ukraine, because it is very difficult to grow grain during a war, and Russia because of the sanctions. Bread prices are rising in Egypt. Yemen is worrying about how to buy bread. So as much as this is a Ukrainian crisis, I wanted to take a little bit of time to be thinking about how the ripples are going to be affecting the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Henderson. Those ripples are mighty. But I think that I want to thank you for your important observations about the ramifications of this war for not just Ukrainian politics, but also for Russian citizens. You know, I think it's a good reminder of the cost of war that those with power impose on those below them. And so at this point, I'd like to turn over the floor to Mark Ward, who will be speaking about the Ukraine refugee crisis in a comparative frame.
Catherine, thanks very much. Can you give me a thumbs up? Do you hear me okay? Great, okay. So yeah, I'm different than the other panelists. You heard Mark Ward, not Dr. Ward or Professor Ward. I'm humbled to be with these academics, but I'm a retired diplomat, over 30 years in the Foreign Service, recently retired, thanks to my son and his family, moved to Corvallis. And in my long career, I had the pretty much unique experience of actually negotiating with the Russians over humanitarian access for about 18 months involving Syria. And my experience negotiating with the Russians over humanitarian access may be instructive for the crisis in Ukraine. So a little bit about how I got into this. I was in charge of the US assistance program at the Turkish-Syrian border for almost 5 years. We were sending massive amounts of aid across the border, a lot of it humanitarian, but also other kinds of aid. This was all overt aid. And when I finished that, Secretary Kerry, back in the Obama administration, asked me to go to Geneva to co-lead a task force with the Russians to try to improve humanitarian access for besieged and hard to reach communities inside Syria. And I did this for about 18 months before I retired. Pretty unique experience negotiating with the Russians every day, pretty much, on a subject that you don't normally associate with the Russians, humanitarian access. How was it supposed to work? Well, the theory was pretty good. The idea was that the United Nations would tell us, the US and Russia, I was the co-lead for the United States, the UN would tell us which communities were most in need of humanitarian assistance, say, that week. And then the idea was that the Russians would try to win agreement from the Damascus regime, the Syrian government, to leave the convoy alone, to allow the UN convoy through. We knew where it was going to go, what the convoy was going to contain, when it was going to go, and that the Russians would then get the government forces to back off and allow the convoy through. My job was to do exactly the same with the rebel forces, which frankly was pretty easy because these were besieged communities that were loyal to the rebels. So the rebels certainly were not going to stop humanitarian convoys coming to their communities. So the real focus of the work was on the Russians. And in the early days, and I would say for 6 months, even a little bit longer, we had a lot of success. And I remember a day where I actually taught my Russian counterparts how a high five works, because we actually had something in common that we were celebrating. But unfortunately, it pretty much all fell apart after that. And in the process, I learned a lot about Russia's commitment to humanitarian access. They talk a good game. I mean, nobody's better at making speeches than Minister Lavrov about the importance of humanitarian aid, but they attack, as we're seeing, innocent civilians and infrastructure with impunity when it suits their military objectives. And I was optimistic at the beginning of this task force, but then the real Russia emerged. Why? What happened? I'm no expert, although I was dealing with them every day. And I chalk it up to two things. One, their military objectives are paramount, no matter what they say about their commitment to anything else, whether that's international norms, whether that's humanitarian principles, it's military objectives that rule the day without question. And secondly, and this is very sad, they did it because they can. There were no consequences. When a Syrian town that was under siege wasn't important to the Syrian regime's starve into surrender strategy, then Russia was happy to push Damascus for humanitarian access. And I think that's the success that we saw at the beginning of the task force, is that the towns that the UN was identifying for humanitarian access at the beginning of our task force were probably not so strategically important. But when the towns were important to Damascus's military objectives, and they were, they were military goals, then humanitarian access was an afterthought, was completely unimportant. And public speeches and negative press had no impact. It actually seemed to embolden the Russians. It's a sad fact that the Russian Federation, at least my impression was, seemed to thrive on international condemnation. And we kept pouring it on to try to shame them, but I don't think it works, and it may in fact backfire. I remember one experience I had too many times where most of my negotiations with the Russians were bilateral, but once a week, the State Department wanted me to co-host a gathering of nations that were interested in Syria. And the Russians were only too happy to participate because they love to give speeches. And we would trade speeches accusing the other of lack of cooperation and doing harm. And I would talk about in front of, say, representatives of 25 to 30 countries, the impact of their inability to win access for these communities under siege. And the Russians would every week sort of accuse me of being trying to be the next Mother Teresa or campaigning for the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, this ridicule your opponent tactic I saw vividly every week. Now, maybe we can talk about what can be done, and something that we thought a lot about and did our best to put to use was technology. And maybe someday technology will be infallible enough that the Russians won't be able to deny evidence of attacks on civilians. But for now, they do. They just call everything, as one of the speakers said before, fake news. Naively, I used to think that Putin cared about his international reputation and his place in history. Well, he cares about his place in history. I got that part right. But I think I was wrong about the legacy that he wants to leave behind. And I very much agree with what Dr. Wanke was saying. He wants to be remembered as the man who restored Russian pride and greatness. International opinion be damned. So can we do anything about this short of military intervention? Dr. Richards talked about tools. Well, sadly, I don't think the UN is effective. Not as long as Russia is a member of the Permanent Five. They can just veto everything. And usually China goes along. So are we left with bilateral sanctions? Until now, Russian resilience, I'm talking about the people now, and nationalism seem to counter the impact of any sanctions on the Russian people. And their pride in surviving the Soviet era famines and the siege of Leningrad fuel this rhetoric today. And in the end, Russians will, I used to live there. I used to hear this regularly. They will proudly survive on potatoes and beets that they're growing in their own dachas to stand up to the world for Russian greatness. Sanctioning Russian elites might help. For example, denying Russian elites like oligarchs travel in the West where they like to enjoy their riches might lead them to pressure Putin to back down. It's hard to be a jet setter if you're stuck in Russia. But they have to be very careful lest they end up imprisoned. I wish my experience, everyone with the Russians over humanitarian assistance in Syria left me more optimistic about Ukraine, but it doesn't. I think we should assume that anything that appears to be a Russian concession on humanitarian access is probably false or a smokescreen for some military objective. Like opening humanitarian corridors away from the fighting for civilians. Sounds good, but then when you see where the corridors are going, straight to Russia, you realize nobody's going to take advantage of it. At least we've learned from the Syria experience that humanitarian access is, despite what they say, is not important to Russia, and we won't waste our time trying to negotiate access that they know they will surely violate. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think it's really helpful to hear about your experiences. I think it helps us to get a better sense of when we do hear these stories. As Sarah had mentioned, the Western media wants to have a really hopeful, rosy picture of what's happening in Ukraine. And any mention of, humanitarian corridors, people get really optimistic about. And I think it's helpful to have this more tempered view. And thanks so much too for your analysis of non-military interventions and our options there. So we have on deck now our final panelist, Dr. Sharyn Clough, who will be speaking about war as a choice and peace as a strategy.
Thank you so much, Katie. And I've got this timed in at around 7 or 8 minutes, so hopefully we can bring this panel home. I'm really grateful to be here with all of you. So for the last 5 years, I've been working as a public philosopher, focusing on a new framework for understanding human behavior called peace literacy, as it applies to deliberations about controversial science policy, like mandatory vaccines and climate mitigation. But increasingly, I'm looking at deliberations about conflicts more generally. So peace literacy involves thinking of peace not just as a goal, but as a set of skills and capacities that need to be taught and practiced across the curriculum from preschool to higher education, with the same rigor and pedagogical scaffolding that we teach literacy in reading, writing, and math. So I work with the team I direct at Phronesis Lab in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, which has sponsored this panel, and as the curriculum coordinator for the Peace Literacy Institute, newly here in Corvallis. Ultimately, we're working to build a world where people are as well trained in waging peace as soldiers are in waging war. Now, that analogy with training for war is not an accident here. The founder of Peace Literacy, Paul K. Chappell, graduated from West Point. He served in Iraq and he left the Army as a captain. And I have to point out that it's thanks to Professor Linda Richards' great peacemaking work that I was introduced to Paul Chappell in the first place in 2016. And he and I have been working together ever since. So I'm grateful for that introduction through Linda's work. And so Paul's background in the military means that peace literacy is very much informed by insights into the human condition that arise in warfare, and to which we all ought pay more attention than we typically do. So I'd like to share 3 of those insights here, as they provide some realistic, evidence-based reasons for hope about humanity, even in the face of the terrible violence being unleashed in Ukraine. So the first insight we get from peace literacy comes from military history. Every military leader since the dawn of recorded military strategy, from ancient Greece, the classical Chinese period, in the Indian subcontinent, into the modern European and American era of warfare, every military strategist has struggled with 2 huge problems. The first one is that it's hard to get people to kill other people. This is why every war requires massive propaganda campaigns to dehumanize enemy combatants as immoral, as evil, as animals. There's a variety of different techniques. So all war is based on the deception of propaganda. It's also why military training involves the routinization of loading, shouldering, and firing weapons. In the same way that, when we first start learning to drive a car, every little step, putting in our seatbelt, putting the key in the ignition, takes all these little steps. But once we've done it over and over and over and over and over again and be really well trained, we can be, driving on the highway before we even remember getting out of the driveway of our home. It's also the fact that it's hard to get people to kill other people is also why militaries have rigorous chains of command to remove individual responsibility for killing. So individual soldiers don't have to make those decisions because they're difficult to make. And finally, it's why militaries are at the leading edge of technologies that ultimately get deployed to make killing from a distance possible. Having soldiers bomb enemy combatants is less traumatizing to those soldiers, right, than making them use bayonets. So the other really hard problem that every military leader has had to struggle with is that it's really hard to get people to die. So it's hard to get people to be willing to kill other people, and it's hard to get people to be willing to die. Now, if you had to die for someone, most people are going to say, they'd be willing to die for their families, right? Now, I should say, I certainly had heard about people who'd served in the military. I have not served in the military, talking about how the people in their unit were like their family members, their brothers, band of brothers. I see most of this I've learned from Hollywood movies, which turns out are not the best place to get this information. With a little more research and talking with Chappell, it turns out that effective military training is designed to get soldiers in their units to feel like they're part of a family before they go under fire. So that they're willing to die for each other before they're even sent off to battle. So it's a very strategic move that effective military training deploys. So the upshot here is that militaries have succeeded in getting people to be willing to kill and die, not by taking advantage of some natural human proclivity for violence, but by taking advantage of the human proclivity to love and protect the people and their families and communities. So this actually makes me really hopeful about humans. You can see in Russia, even with Putin having almost complete control over his propaganda machine, that the truth is getting out. Russian soldiers are discovering that they are not in Ukraine to protect their Ukrainian brothers and sisters from Nazis. They are not being welcomed as freedom fighters. This makes them absolutely less willing to kill. And the Ukrainians conscripted to fight, even though they don't all have the kind of rigorous training that makes them able to be effective at killing, they're very expressing their willingness to save their families. So the first insight I want to share from peace literacy, it's hard to get people to kill, and it's hard to get people to be willing to die. None of what we are seeing in Ukraine is natural or inevitable. People have inhibitions against killing and dying that have to be overcome with a great deal of effort. So the second insight from peace literacy I want to share of the three is that we cannot overestimate the role of trauma at the individual level and intergenerationally. Years of collective decision making involved in your right in Ukrainian life. The trauma of World War II or present War II, and it occurred in any number of ways. Past becomes present. Trauma is one of the most powerful forces that can break down our inhibition against killing and our inhibition against dying, but it's also hard to control. Traumatized soldiers can kill not only enemy combatants, but also civilians, their own leaders, and themselves. So militaries try to minimize trauma, even as they cause it. So trauma is a plane of reality. It's this hidden dimension that we need to understand before we can effectively resolve conflict of any kind, but especially war. A third and final insight that I wanted to share from peace literacy is, given that we do not teach students how to wage peace with anything like the rigor and time and money and effort we put in preparing soldiers for waging war, and even in fact that we teach students the opposite of waging peace, in the models that they see on social and entertainment media, in the models they get in their religious leadership, and the models they see on the political landscape, they get the opposite of waging peace. And so we cannot be surprised when violence erupts. But we shouldn't feel hopeless here. At this point, Chappelle often will move to basketball as an analogy. I appreciate Dr. Wanke's analogies with playing pool. Imagine now a basketball game where you sent a bunch of kids out onto the basketball court, gave them a basketball and absolutely no training in how to play, no understanding of the rules of the game, and it would be just chaos, right? No one would be scoring, there would be no organization, it would be a mess. The important lesson here is we wouldn't watch all that and weep for humanity, right? We'd teach the kids how to play basketball. In the same way, when we see what we're seeing in the Ukraine, in the US, in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, our own communities, we shouldn't be surprised, because we've not given kids, students, adults, any training in doing anything else. So what if, in fact, we train people in some peace skills, and we did it strategically, and we did it with a great deal of effort and organization and funding? I want to recognize finally here that in the face of the overwhelming and catastrophic violence we're seeing in Ukraine, it can seem like calls for teaching peace skills are kind of hopeless and naive. But if we focus, rather than at the bigness of it, if we focus in on the many individual decisions and interactions that led to the start of the war and its escalation in boardrooms and on the streets, in family rooms, there are innumerable places where a little peace literacy can make a huge difference. So that's the work. And I invite you to check out our free curriculum at peaceliteracy.org. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I think it's helpful to end on a bit of a hopeful note. And those are some powerful analogies there. So at this point, I would like to open up this conversation to the panelists to ask questions of one another. And I also invite further questions on the Q&A discussion board. We've answered some of those live through the chat function, but we're happy to bring some of those up but I just wanted to give an opportunity for some of the panelists to bounce off one another.
Well, thank you, Katie. One of the questions that I answered, I really wanted to know what Mark Ward thought of it. So if we could bring up the Q&A, let's see here. The question came from Joe Newman. Do any of the speakers see a way to end this war currently? It seems some of the updates since the last meeting are possible openings for peace talks, or are they? And I said something like, I don't know what I even answered. I just said, you know, there was negotiations in Istanbul, but I'm just reading right now on my phone at the same time about the pullout of the troops from Chernobyl and how people are very concerned that the Russian army is just regrouping under the guise of negotiations. So I would embellish my answer just from a few minutes ago. But I said there's always a chance negotiations could work if the price of the invasion is higher than the price for negotiating. And then I said, I wonder what Mark thinks. And then Sarah also answered it. Hi, Joe. I don't think right now there are openings for peace talks. I think part of that is that Putin is really the only one with the authority to make a deal. The B team is at negotiations. And I agree with Mark Ward's comments that Russian negotiating teams usually have different goals. For Russia, I fear it's to gain time, which kind of confirms what the news report from just an hour ago implied.
I guess I would say Russia's got to get something out of it, or the negotiations aren't going to work. We negotiated a lot with the Russians, not just on humanitarian access, but on ceasefires as well for Syria. They don't act according to, because of international principles. They don't act because of international pressure. They don't act because of international condemnation, or, you know, the prospect of being seen as some kind of a champion of principles and international law. It's going to be very close to Russian interests, which in this case is probably Putin's interests. So as long as he remains the signal caller, to continue with our sports analogies, he's got to get something out of this, I think, for the negotiations to work. Over. That, by the way, that's Mark Ward speaking, not the State Department. I no longer work for them.
So Mark, I have a question. So one of the things that's been speculated is, that, Crimea will stay with Russia. These are the various scenarios that are being proposed. If the Russia needs to get something. So Crimea stays as part of Russia. And then Donetsk and Lugansk were essentially looking at, I don't know what you think, Paul, kind of right up to the entire district. One of the issues that's been called into question is, that would certainly be territory, and those are two big concerns for Russia. But would that kind of be sufficient? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Because I think you are right. There's going to have to be, there's no such thing that Ukraine stays, there's no going back to before 2014.
I would just want to remind us that all players in these kind of conflicts are working from needs for self-worth and purpose and meaning and need for being part of strong communities. And all Russia isn't alone here. Putin isn't alone here in trying to meet these needs that he has and that he sees for his fellow Russians. And the United States is very similar. So I think attending to some of the psychology of this is going to be helpful. And there's quite a bit we know about the psychology of Putin, and not a lot of what he's doing is surprising.
I mean, nobody needs to lecture the Ukrainians on Russian motives and intent and strategy, but I would be very concerned that any deal that's struck that involves geography and borders, how do you enforce it? How do you hold Russia to that? Agreements with them can be very fleeting.
So I wanted to bring a question in from the question and answer forum, especially one that deals with the topic of negotiation and Russia's aims and Putin's aims here. Someone had asked that they'd mentioned that they've heard that Putin is not being fully briefed on what's happening. Why would his cronies choose to keep information from him? And how does this change potentially the trajectory of the war? And so I was curious, Mark, actually, with your background in diplomacy and understanding a bit of how the communication seems to work or rolls downhill, your take on this, on some of the claims that Putin's fallen into the dictator trap, for instance.
I mean, so my life for the last couple of years has been very much focused on Afghanistan. I lived in Afghanistan for 2 years running a humanitarian organization after I retired from the government. And of course, everybody wants to know what went wrong there. Well, one of the things that went wrong there is that the leadership didn't know what was going on. The military commanders were being told it's okay. The politicians were being told it's going well. It's not just in Russia. This is a problem that political and military leaders who sit in bubbles face. I mean, without naming names, I can tell you that meetings that I used to attend in Kabul of senior military leaders where frustration boiled over into screaming from senior generals to their those below them to please tell me the truth about what's going on the battlefield. That was a few years ago. I'm not saying that was happening more recently. So wouldn't surprise me if that's going on. And Putin's anger is anger I have seen displayed by many leaders, both civilian and military. It is a problem that I think all militaries face, is getting your chain of command to be honest with you about failures on the battlefield and not worry, and this is the problem, not worry that you're going to, be demoted or thrown out for having spoken the truth.
Yeah, and Sarah.
If I could just add on to that, I do think that's a common problem. I think it's exacerbated extraordinarily in Russia by a 20+ year campaign to kind of slowly chop away at checks on the president's power as well, in addition to what Mark was talking about. So, I think all of the opportunities, whether it's through the legislature, through, free media, civil society, et cetera, all those kind of normal checks that we associate with providing unpleasant news. I think President Putin has gradually weeded out those abilities. So part of this is also the larger ramifications of kind of slowly establishing a personalist system of rule too.
Yeah, and Paul, you had something to
add. When you said there was a bubble, historically speaking, you're looking back at Russia, when you get during the so-called times of troubles in the 17th century, and they finally came upon the idea of the Romanov family being the czars and so on like that, the difference between the so-called the people and the czar, that was a chasm, not a bubble. There's the great story of on the 300th anniversary, Nicholas II was attending some big function, and they had free liquor and food there in Moscow, and a riot broke out and hundreds of people were killed. And when the Tsar was told about that, he said, not much I can do. And he went to the French embassy and continued on with this party. And that, I think, in my opinion, carried over to the Soviets. People were too frightened to tell Joe Stalin what may or may not have been going on. And so I agree with you and with Sarah that this is a pattern. And I don't know that I would have the the guts. I'm trying to clean up the act here, to tell Putin that your plan is going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I wanted to raise another question from the Q&A board, and one that actually relates to something that Sarah had mentioned about, one potential ramification of this conflict is that there might be some overlap for compromise. Sarah, you mentioned that Zelensky has talked about Ukrainian neutrality. So I was curious kind of what would that look like? And then sort of related to this question from the Q&A board, I've heard that a two-state Ukraine, I guess maybe these questions dovetail a bit, but that a two-state Ukraine is an option that's being discussed. It seems that Russia would definitely want this option, but do you think Zelensky or the global democracies would agree to something like this?
So one thing I was thinking about is, so Ukrainian neutrality. So Zelensky hasn't really hammered this out. From what I can tell, I feel like he's just sort of trying to signal, and part of this is kind of his very effective, and I mean this not in a negative way when I say PR campaign, but just sort of, he's done an enormously effective job for a country that's relatively weak, sort of building alliances. So, I think part of that is just signaling, how the logistics would work of like how, he keeps saying Ukrainians would need to agree with this. I think right now it's just all still talk. I think as Mark has mentioned, I think Sergei Lavrov is not, even though he's the, Secretary of State, he is not, he does not have the authority to make a deal. Like nobody is actually talking at the table who has the authority to make a deal. And so we can speculate, but I just think neither side is exhausted enough where a realistic deal can be made. And in fact, it was so weird. I don't know did anybody watch the interview with Zelensky, The Economist? They went to Ukraine, they interviewed him. I watched the video. And in the video, he's talking about things like neutrality and, perhaps giving up territory. And then on The Economist today, their kind of big editorial is Ukraine can win this, which was precisely not what Zelensky was saying in the interview. So I don't know if anybody else saw this. It was incredibly bizarre and disturbing that to kind of, it was such a different interview than kind of the framing and the shaping that The Economist gave it. So I'm kind of off topic, but the larger thing is I still feel we are really far away from actually talking about something. I don't know what other people think. I wish we were close, but wars tend to last years, not a month.
Yeah, do any of our other panelists have more optimistic views?
I would love to hear a more optimistic view. I mean, I really would.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to be optimistic for no reason, but there is examples of ceasefires that happen, not necessarily the kind of negotiations or development of the negotiations, but there could be those kinds of agreements, right, at any time for any length. And I actually started to wonder about a question that was up here by an anonymous attendee. Do you think if Ukraine had agreed to not seek NATO or EU membership, that war could have been averted? And it makes me actually think about the kind of mechanisms that have the opportunities that we've had in the past to scale down some of the US militarism that might have contributed to this. And I'm not trying to excuse any militarism on anyone's part. I'm against militarism anywhere when it's not in self-defense, right? So to me, there's many places where the US could have made different decisions, just like in a negotiation or in a warfare situation. At any moment, there could be unexpected resolutions that we haven't anticipated. And one of the things we didn't talk about today, although we included Mark Ward, is the role of all these NGOs and civil society in these different, just the different influences that are far beyond nation state or the geopolitical analysis. So like, I'm kind of looking at this in terms of I brought in Erica Chenoweth because I'm thinking about large scale shifts on how we resolve conflicts, from militarism to much more nonviolence being used to resolve them through social power, right? Social societies organizing on their own behalf. And so I actually see that there's more options to resolve conflicts than there may have been in the past currently. And so there may be some unexpected players that influence things. I actually was on the phone with Ukrainian activists recently who wanted the world to know that they don't really want to be just witnessed. You know, they would like a no-fly zone, but they listed off all the actions they're taking that are nonviolent resistance also, and they're coordinating on an international scale with other Russian mothers. And it's just, you know, there's a lot out there that could change the dynamics that we aren't used to seeing.
Well, I think the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers in Russia is one avenue, right? That's kind of something that Putin has been unable to squelch as an NGO that I think is a very effective possibility for kind of rousing outrage because it's very hard to oppress and squelch angered mothers about where is my son. And so they kind of, they sort of go against the framework that Putin has of like NGOs are just agents of the West. And so Committee of Soldiers' Mothers kind of is a group of mothers of soldiers that started during the Afghan war trying to hunt down their kids, what happened to them. And then I think one of the things Sherry had mentioned, which I thought was interesting, is Putin's National Guard are actually refusing to go into Ukraine, right? Saying that it's not their, you know, that's not their remit. They have to stay domestically. And they're actually using the Russian courts to say, no, we should not have to go fight. So I think that's also really kind of these little interesting shoots that Sherry was referencing that I think are, I don't know how powerful they'll be, but I certainly think their potentials.
I mean, one unfortunate lesson we learned from Syria is that the Russians are quick to label humanitarian organizations as fronts for terrorism. We had in place for the organizations that we were funding deconfliction, where we would provide GPS coordinates of where our clinics were to provide to the Russian Federation, who at that time was controlling the skies, and didn't work. I mean, not only did it not work, it led to attacks on clinics by the Russian Air Force or the haphazard Syrian Air Force, which basically just dropped barrel bombs. And more over the years, as civil society in Syria started to speak up, and some of you may have heard stories about the valiant white helmets that would actually go in as first responders after attacks, and the Russians just attacked them. They labeled them terrorists with no foundation whatsoever, and then attacked them. And so I know there is a bit of a fear among the international NGO community that is setting itself up on Ukraine's borders. You know, what fate meets us if we do cross the border and try to provide assistance cross-border inside Ukraine, remembering the experience in Syria. So I just say that because again, I think the expectation before Syria was that if you're engaged in humanitarian work and you deconflict, you're probably all right. Of course, there will be accidents. There's not that assumption anymore. And so, you know, I'm no longer with an international, a big NGO, but I do think, you know, that your contributions to the organizations listed on the chat, just, you know, keep in mind, these are organizations, to the extent they're working cross-border, they're taking big risks to try to provide humanitarian assistance to people, because the Russians will go after them. I mean, they are assuming that they will become targets. Very, very sad.
Thank you, Mark. I think Paul wanted to add on.
I don't know if it's hopeful, but just imagine what a flash panel like us would look like in 1985, and someone would suggest that the Cold War would end without the 82nd Airborne marching down through Red Square. If anything changes, historically speaking, I would suspect it comes from within. Like you say, Russian mothers saying, "This is enough is enough." You know, I mean, Americans had no knowledge of Russian vocabulary and language, and then a word come glasnost comes along, and openness, and for some reason it clicked. And again, it wasn't the Cold War, it wasn't Vietnam or Korea and stuff like that. It was the Russians, for whatever reason, it clicked at that period of time. And it may be a history of autocratic leaders. Autocracy can work in a couple of ways, and one of which is that could be brutal and despotic, like maybe Stalin and Putin, but you know, you might get a Yeltsin or a Gorbachev. Remember Yeltsin standing on a tank, you know, preventing the coup against Gorbachev right there in Moscow. So I don't know if it's good or bad, but my suspicion is how this ends, if it ends well, arguably speaking, it's going to end because of what happens within Russia.
Well, keeping it with the topic of both the power of kind of collective action, civil society movements, and domestic action in Russia, I wanted to bring up a question that was posed in the Q&A forum by Marisa Chappelle. Do any of you see the erosion/destruction of even the pretense of democratic governance and free speech, et cetera, in Russia as a cost of this war, or is it better understood only as an enabling factor, making the war possible?
Just kind of jumping back to where Paul took us, to the end of the Cold War, it made me think about how the US actually had an opportunity to also be less materialistic and much more supportive of the former Soviet Union too. It was a golden opportunity that I saw. Instead, a lot of graft and a lot of missed opportunities there, particularly for nuclear weapons disarmament. We do have a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons now due to civil society, but it would have been a natural gain for humanity had they worked closer together. But I really think Putin has, I mean, I'm not an analyst on that level, but I just see this increasing aggression over time and erosion of free speech over time that's been happening in Russia. So I think definitely it enabled what's happening now. And the US did too. I'd like to comment on the anonymous attendee who mentioned, one of them who mentioned, you know, what about the US, their own failed agreements and lack of their own war crimes, basically, and lack of following international law. And I believe that, yes, all of that lack of accountability has contributed to the moment we are in. And that's why I'm suggesting that civil society should create new institutions that are not based on force and coercion.
Going off of that, Linda, and to answer your question, Marisa, so there's like the pace of passing legislation that makes it really hard to organize increased significantly after the 2011-2012 protests when Putin came back into power after Medvedev and he switched places. And if you look statistically, something like 39 different pieces of legislation have been passed since then to both make it hard for NGOs to operate, for citizens to protest. for the media to operate and even for social media to be able to keep the data of its clients private. So that all predated the war. And so the even draconian things that we're seeing happening now, it's kind of, it's just part of a longer legacy in which in some ways, you know, Putin is sort of surrounded by enemies from without, right? The West is the biggest enemy, but also enemy number two is his own society in the sense of the way he's framed legislation. It's that there's a good civil society, which is patriotic, and then there's a bad civil society, which is, you know, Western. So it's, you know, it started, and then with the war, it's gotten completely worse. And so getting to Linda's point, I think, you know, what's so hard is it's so hard and it's so brave of everyday average Russians to actually try to get out there and protest because the costs are so high, so unbelievably high, to particularly with the enhanced role of the state in terms of employment and its role in the economy. Like, it's not just prison, it's your job, all sorts of things that are at risk.
And last count I saw was 16,000 had been detained in Russia. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. And again, yes, I mean, it's treating your own population as if they're enemies. You know, national security enemy number one is internal at this point.
So I wanted to pose a question that maybe brings us maybe too quickly to what things might look like at the conclusion of this war or at some sort of cessation of conflict. And this has to do with cost to infrastructure in particular. And back in the Q&A, Rich Wittrup asks, with the amount of horrific damage done to buildings, infrastructure, and the carnage and displacement of millions of people, who will end up helping rebuild after the end of this war? I mean, what, as panelists, I mean, do you imagine we would see something like the response of the Allies following World War II? I mean, given our very interconnected global economy?
Well, I'm still waiting for our help to go to Afghanistan, you know? So I'm not sure how Mark feels about this question. I am curious how he feels about it. Where do we rebuild from the many wars as Americans? What's the best place to contribute?
I guess maybe the political scientist in me would say that I think there's an unspoken bargain that in exchange for that EU membership is the price that Ukraine deserves for, in some ways, not getting a no-fly zone enforcement. I don't know, you know, I think unfortunately countries have very short memories. So right now there's a lot of outpouring of support, and I don't know how long that will last, but I'm guessing that EU, potentially the United States, and it's I would think sort of a payment in exchange for not willing to go to war for Ukraine. I don't know what others think.
I actually could see that. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean,
I agree. I think I suspect that Washington is looking to the EU to take the lead when that day arrives, but in some sort of supporting actor capacity, the US will be there, or World Bank will be there. We used to actually try this argument on the Russians with Syria, of, you know, when the bombing was, particularly of Aleppo, was beyond belief, rhetorically asking the Russians, who do you think is going to pay to rebuild Syria? And they would look at us, and I think they were serious, and say, well, we expect the United States will help. And, you know, our basic response, at least then in the Obama administration, was, you broke it, you fix it. We're not interested. But this is a very different situation. I expect the United States, again, depending on how it ends up and whether there's a sense that, you know, Ukraine's equities have been met to some extent, the United States will be a player.
So taking another question from the Q&A forum, this is a question that's directed to, or is related to observation that Sarah made. So the question says, Sarah, you mentioned that some Ukrainians are fleeing to Russia. Can you explain who these people are and what their motivations are to flee there? Do you know how easy it is to go there?
Yeah, I have no idea. And I was just checking the operational data portal on UNHCR. And I was surprised to see that because that number actually has gone up a lot for Russia. So I know there have been all these news stories about, kind of Russia taking Ukrainians to Russia. I don't know if it's ethnic Russians fleeing to Russia, although I don't think we can really assume anymore that ethnic Russians living in Ukraine are immediately going to want to go to Russia. So I like the person who asked the question. That's actually the first thing I'm going to do when I get off, because I saw that number 5 minutes before I got on, and I was like, what is that, right? Are those Eastern Ukrainians? But even there's so many ethnic Russian Eastern Ukrainians who don't want anything to do with Russia after this. So it's a giant mystery.
Yeah, thanks for helping us.
I'm actually looking at the number right now, and it's saying it's saying 350,000, which is the same number that's gone to Hungary. So I don't know who's reporting this data to the UN. So
Yeah, that's an important question to ask too, right? So thinking about actually that Eastern Ukrainian population, you had mentioned that Russia, by reshifting, if they continue to reshift their focus, if they do on Eastern Ukraine, you mentioned that it could be worse for the Ukrainian population there. So is that simply because of the warfare that would be concentrated there, or would it have to do with the kind of new political apparatus that could be established?
I think Paul might be the military expert here, but by polling people, right now they're spread really thinly, the Russian army, in 3 different places, right? Kind of the north, the east, and the south. And so by, in some ways, concentrating on the east, it will reposition, it'll simply give the Russian army greater kind of manpower right there. And in some ways kind of fully pursue the sort of Chechen military policy of kind of razing the area to the ground. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's kind of a rule of thumb that if you're the offensive power, you should have a ratio of roughly 3-to-1 versus who you're going against. And when you look at them, the numbers were impressive. As the Russians were building up. But if you think of that as an invading force that's going to conquer Ukraine and stuff like that, it actually seemed like they were very underwhelming. I still remember, I can't think of his name, but the general who went before Congress and said we may need 500,000 for the invasion of Iraq, and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, practically got him fired. It just seems to me that their invasion force was not nearly large enough, especially if you're going from north to south, you're trying to engage all of that. So like what you're saying, Sarah, to reposition and just focus those troops on a particular section and then succeed there. And like I was saying with the pool game, depending on where the cue ball ends, they could then regroup and then, look for other objectives. And one quick thing regarding economics, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. You hear all about these Javelin missiles and how effective they are against Russian tanks. Just pure economics, one of those missiles is a fraction of the cost of one of those tanks. And that is going to play out. on an economy that last I heard, I think the economy of Russia before the war was the equivalent of the state of Florida. You know, the human loss obviously is terrible. On the other hand, if you're not concerned about that, the economic costs are astronomical.
So Russia's losing too many tanks, you're saying? Like it's
If the reports are even half true, it's for what it's worth, it's almost as if, in my mind, when the American Civil War breaks out, pretty much all of the top generals were taught Napoleonic warfare. It'll be interesting to see whether or not, when they got in the Civil War, they were going against rifled muskets, which is a whole different kind of warfare. And I can almost guarantee you that there are Russians and people in the American military right now who are starting to ask the question as to whether or not the game is changing, and long-term are tanks and armored vehicles, let's say, losing perhaps their importance.
Yeah, Linda.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on that, because one of the things I meant to talk about was just the concerns that people have around the idea of nuclear power plants perhaps being used as a type of, a weapon in a way, or just the changing order of things because of this particular way that Putin has, or the Russian forces have fought near the large nuclear power plant and then taken control of them. And so this is a new kind of experience for, strategists who think about how wars are fought, along with the whole element of social media too. So what's true, what's not, even on the list of questions, there's some basic things we don't know. Are they true or are they propaganda, right?
So at this point, I think we have about, we could set aside 5 more minutes for this panel, and then to let everyone go for the rest of the night. But I did want to ask kind of a large overarching question, which is probably not smart to ask a question that could take 30 minutes to answer, if not a whole book. But this question has to do with the global political order, right? So like 2 minutes tops, right, to talk about. So the question is, how does this global incident affect, US-Taiwan tensions with China? I mean, how does it? And Sarah, the last, the previous flash panel you talked about, seeing, and Chris Nichols talked too about, we've seen kind of the decline of commitments to this post-World War II order. And obviously in the past, Russia and China, the Soviet Union and China have had a unique relationship over the years. But what does this global incident do? What does it say about our tensions with China and what China might be thinking about doing next?
Well, I think we're all thinking about this. I think China is watching very carefully, kind of what's happening. I think Sergei Lavrov is just now with China and India, like meeting. Maybe one thing I'm thinking about a lot is, I think it's been valuable seeing more unity among Europe and the United States, and sort of actually saying like, hey, democracy is really important. And so on the one hand, I think when people ask what can I do about Ukraine, one thing I would say to students is like, care about voting rights in the United States, because this is how it all begins. When you look at Putin as sort of slowly chipping away at citizens' access to be able to try to stop the president from doing something. So by way of answering your question, I think one thing that's really important is we can't stop thinking about the need to regenerate democracy at home. Otherwise, when I think about Ukraine, I'm actually awake at night. I don't know if anyone else is worried about the midterms or the presidential election, depending on who gets elected. That has vital ramifications about what might happen with the sanctions, whether there's going to be unity. you know, if Trump runs again, that's a very different situation for Russia. So I'm expecting Russia to have a really vested interest in who wins. The other thing I worry about is that even though the West is unified, of course, the global balance of power has changed. And, you know, the United States and Western Europe are not the only powers in the world. And so it's worrying about kind of the optics of sort of how this unity looks to the developing world, rising powers like India, like China. I don't think we can necessarily say this is a trade, you know, a face-off between democracy and authoritarian regimes. You know, United States is going to have to find a way to work with China on things like climate change. So we both need to strengthen democracy at home, but also kind of realize this isn't the post-World War II era anymore, where we have the same kind of moral authority. And I guess I really wanted to ask Sherry a question about how you can teach peace literacy in authoritarian systems where it's hard to access society, but I guess I won't have time to ask. So, sorry.
That'll be for our next, we'll have some coffee and think about this.
Okay.
I think, well, Linda's just so good at reminding us of the power of civil societies and your own reminders as well about all of this starts at home. I don't want to psychologize things too much, but I think that many of us as academics are really happy spending time at the policy level, at the history level, at the narrative level. And I'm just learning now in midlife at the importance of sinking down into some of the motivations day to day that can over time have these ripple effects, whether it be voting. So the conversations we have with our neighbors right now are related to all of this in some really, really important ways. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. I think that that's a really great message to take away from this. So unfortunately, we don't have any more time, but I want to thank all of the panelists and thank all of the attendees for taking the time to contend with these issues. I hope you all have a good evening and be well. Thank you.